She was used to walking into boardrooms and being the most powerful person in the room, but on that morning she was mistaken for a delivery driver. It was the kind of moment most people would brush off. But Jessica Carter wasn't most people. She was a self-made billionaire, the CEO of Carter Innovations, and arguably the most influential black woman in tech. Yet here she was, standing in the pristine glass lobby of Brenton and Company, being sized up by a receptionist who didn't even bother to lift her eyes from her phone at first glance. Jessica had come for a high-stakes meeting, one that could have redefined the future of both companies, but what she received instead was a slap in the face, dressed up as a casual insult. "Deliveries go around the back," the woman said without hesitation, her tone flat, dismissive. Jessica didn't correct her immediately. She didn't explain who she was. She just looked at the receptionist, one Ashley Garner, according to the tiny gold nameplate pinned proudly to her blazer, and gave a small nod. No reaction, no hint of recognition, and certainly no respect. Jessica took a breath and asked politely, "I have a 9 a.m. with Mr. Langston." Still nothing. Ashley didn't even type her name in. She just tilted her head, smirked, and replied with a scoff, "If you're here for catering or something, the service entrance is around the back." Then came the final blow. "People like you don't come in through the front." That sentence hung in the air for a moment, heavy and sharp, like the sound of glass cracking under pressure. Jessica stood still, not because she was stunned. This wasn't new to her. She had faced racism cloaked in corporate politeness before, but this time it was raw, it was unfiltered, and it was happening in a place she had considered investing hundreds of millions into. Her mind, always strategic, started shifting gears. She could feel it, the subtle click of resolve setting in. This wouldn't be handled with a complaint to HR. Jessica Carter didn't take notes. She made moves. Behind her, a tall man in a tailored suit stepped out of an elevator and paused. Mark Jennings, Brenton's executive vice president, watched the scene unfold. His eyes narrowed slightly as he immediately recognized Jessica. Not just from the proposal packet he'd reviewed last week, but from business headlines, interviews, TED Talks. He knew who she was, but he didn't move. He didn't say a word. Instead, he leaned against the glass wall with a smirk curling faintly at the corner of his mouth, letting it happen, letting her be humiliated. Jessica, still silent, offered one last chance for the receptionist to correct course. "Please check again. My name is Jessica Carter." Ashley laughed under her breath. "Yeah, and I'm Oprah. Look, I don't have time for games. You're not on the list, so unless you want me to call security..." But security was already moving. Ashley had waved over two guards like she was flagging down a taxi, and before Jessica could say another word, they were beside her, firm hands on her arms, gently but insistently urging her toward the exit. She didn't resist. She didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. But her eyes, those eyes, locked with Ashley's for one long, piercing second. And without saying anything, Jessica made a promise, not a threat. A promise, one that Ashley wouldn't understand until it was too late. Outside, the sun hit the pavement hard as Jessica walked away, pulling out her phone. No anger, no chaos, just a simple command. Pull the offer, effective immediately. Upstairs, Mark turned back toward his office, eyes gleaming. He had just watched a once-in-a-generation opportunity burn to ashes and done nothing to stop it. Not because he didn't know better, but because deep down he didn't want Carter Innovations anywhere near Brenton. And Jessica Carter's calm, measured reaction? That was the last thing he expected. Because what he didn't see, what none of them saw, was that Jessica hadn't walked away. She had just begun to circle, and she was about to bring down everything they had built, not with fire, not with fury, but with something far more devastating, precision. By the time the doors closed behind her, the story had already shifted. Jessica Carter, the billionaire tech icon, had just been thrown out like a nuisance, and none of them realized. The moment she walked out was the moment Brenton & Co.'s clock started ticking. The moment Jessica Carter stepped into her car, the interior quiet and cool. She didn't sigh, didn't vent, didn't even flinch. She simply reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and pressed a single button, a number on speed dial. It rang once. The person on the other end picked up immediately, her executive operations lead, Marcus, who had been standing by for this exact scenario. Jessica's voice was calm, crisp, and controlled. Initiate Plan B. Cancel the acquisition talks with Brenton and Company. Effective immediately. I want the statement ready for release within the hour. And start the asset review. We're pulling out of all current alignments with any of their affiliate vendors. She didn't need to explain. Marcus didn't need to ask questions. They had prepared for this. Jessica had learned long ago that the best way to know a company wasn't in spreadsheets or board meetings. It was in how they treated people when they didn't know they were being watched. And Brenton and Company had just failed that test. Spectacularly. What Ashley Garner and Mark Jennings didn't know was that Jessica hadn't come to Brenton for a simple business deal. This was a partnership proposal that would have delivered them out of a slow, quiet financial spiral they'd been trying to cover up for months. Jessica had already reviewed their financials, seen the red flags, the slipping numbers tucked away behind inflated forecasts. She knew the truth, that Brenton was dangerously close to a tipping point. The deal on the table was a parachute, a rescue mission wrapped in opportunity. Jessica hadn't needed them. They had needed her. And now, by the time they realized what they'd thrown away, it would be far too late to undo it. As her car pulled away from the curb and into the city's morning rush, the decision was already in motion. Teams at Carter Innovations were rerouting scheduled payments, freezing planned resource-sharing agreements, and scrubbing any branding materials that connected the two companies. Jessica sat back in her seat, glancing once more at the Brenton Tower vanishing in the distance. Her lips curled into the slightest smile, not of revenge, of certainty. This wasn't retaliation. This was clarity. If a company was willing to humiliate a black woman in their lobby, especially one who also happened to be a key investor, potential partner, and visionary in their field, then that was all she needed to know about their values. No boardroom apology could fix what had just been revealed in real time. Jessica's silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Meanwhile, inside the Brenton building, no one yet knew what had just happened outside. The receptionist went back to scrolling through her phone, sipping her designer latte, exchanging chuckles with a coworker over how these people always show up pretending to be someone. Ashley had no clue that in less than 24 hours her name would be trending for all the wrong reasons. But upstairs in the executive suite, a storm was already brewing. Within hours, whispers started circulating. First came an urgent call from Brenton's finance team. One of Carter Innovations' liaison firms had just pulled out of a shared vendor agreement. Then, a key licensing partner backed out of a renewal. Next came the board secretary, her voice tight with confusion as she informed the CEO, Harold Brenton, that Carter Innovations had issued a formal termination of all discussions, and that the press release would go live within the next 30 minutes. At first, Harold laughed. "That's ridiculous. Jessica Carter is scheduled to meet us today. That's probably a mix-up." Then the reality hit like a punch to the gut when his assistant, red-faced and panicked, admitted that she never even made it to the meeting. She showed up. She was turned away. Security escorted her out. They thought she wasn't a guest. Silence followed. Then came the rising dread. Harold slammed his fist on the table. Who? Who sent her out?" No one spoke. Not at first, until one of the interns in the room, pale and trembling, murmured, "The receptionist, Ashley." That single word, that one name, changed the temperature of the entire room. Downstairs, Ashley was still laughing with her coworker when her phone buzzed, dozens of times in rapid succession. She blinked, confused, then picked it up. Group chats, internal alerts, public notifications. Then came the headline, already live, Carter Innovations cancels Brenton deal amid allegations of discriminatory behavior. her face drained of color. She turned in her chair slowly, noticing the once friendly faces around her had shifted. Whispers were spreading fast. She stood up too quickly, knocking over her coffee. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone, dialing HR with fingers that no longer moved steadily. But it was already too late. Across the city, investors saw the headline and panicked. Brenton's stock dipped in the first hour. Then it plunged. By lunchtime, multiple partners had reached out to pause contracts. A major supplier initiated an early exit clause, and behind closed doors, board members began questioning leadership. How could a receptionist derail an entire company's future? But the more they dug, the more they realized. It wasn't just Ashley. It was the culture that enabled her, protected her, rewarded her bias with complacency. Carter Innovations wasn't just walking away from a deal. They were exposing Brenton and Company's core for what it was. Jessica didn't make another public statement that day. She didn't need to. The world was already watching, and Brenton & Co. was already unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of a decision made in less than 5 minutes, all because one woman chose to judge a book by its cover, never realizing that the author could erase her entire chapter from the story. Ashley Garner always thought she had the pulse of the office. She took pride in her perfectly curated workspace, her carefully chosen wardrobe, her proximity to the company's power brokers, even if it was just from behind the front desk. In her mind, she wasn't just a receptionist. She was the gatekeeper, the first line of judgment, the one who could tell, at a glance, who was worthy of walking through Brenton & Company's glass doors and who wasn't. That morning, she'd made a snap decision like she always did, based on clothes, tone, appearance. She didn't check the appointment list. She didn't ask questions. She trusted her gut, and her gut told her Jessica Carter wasn't important. What Ashley failed to realize was that this particular misjudgment wasn't going to get smoothed over by a quiet apology or an HR memo. This one was going to cost her far more than a bad performance review. It was going to shatter everything she had built. By late afternoon, the air around her desk felt different. Colleagues who had laughed with her hours earlier now avoided eye contact. The security guards who once greeted her like a friend stood stiffly by their post, refusing even a nod. The intern who usually brought her coffee walked past her without a word. Then came the email. One cold, impersonal line from HR. Please report to room 5C at 3 p.m. Mandatory compliance review. Ashley felt her throat tighten. She tried to play it cool, brushing it off, even joking to a colleague about being in trouble again. But no one laughed. She was alone now, and deep down, she knew why. When she entered the HR room, she was met by silence. Not the kind that precedes a conversation, but the kind that follows a verdict. Janet Collins, the company's head of HR, didn't even look up from the folder in front of her at first. "Sit," she said flatly. Ashley obeyed, her smile faltering. Janet finally looked up, her face expressionless. "Do you know who you turned away this morning?" Ashley swallowed. "Some woman claiming she had a meeting?" Her voice trailed off as Janet pushed a printed page across the table. There was a photo at the top, Jessica Carter, Forbes cover, arms folded confidently. Ashley's face went pale. She tried to speak, to offer an excuse, but Janet cut her off. "You didn't just turn away a guest. You humiliated the CEO of the company we were in final negotiations with. You cost this company a multi-million-dollar partnership, and now our stock is in freefall. Do you understand what you've done?" Ashley stammered. I didn't know. She didn't look like, I thought," but there was no sentence she could finish that would make any of this right. Not in Janet's eyes, not in the eyes of the board, not in the eyes of the public. By the time she left that room, her badge was deactivated, her inbox locked, her name removed from every employee roster. She packed her desk in silence. No one offered help. No one said goodbye. A job she had held for 7 years, gone in a single morning because she made one assumption and clung to it with arrogance. She left the building carrying a cardboard box, her heels clicking across the tile, with a finality that echoed in her chest. The outside world was no kinder. Her name was already circulating online. A viral clip from internal security footage had been leaked. Her dismissive gesture, her smirk, her words, "People like you don't come in the front." There it was, inescapable, condemning. But what Ashley couldn't have imagined, not even in her most panicked moments, was that she had been just one pawn in a much larger game, one that was already unfolding behind the polished doors of the executive suite. While Ashley was being escorted out, Mark Jennings sat in his office with a glass of scotch, casually spinning in his chair, watching the markets react to Carter Innovations' withdrawal. He hadn't planned it to go quite like this, but it was working in his favor all the same. For months, Mark had been quietly undermining the partnership between Brenton and Carter. He knew Jessica Carter represented everything the company needed: vision, capital, future-proof strategy. But to Mark, she was a threat, not just because of her influence or success, but because her arrival risked exposing what he had spent years building, a quiet empire of control behind the CEO's back. Mark had long believed he was the rightful heir to the company's leadership. And if Harold Brenton couldn't see that, then maybe it was time for Harold to go. When he saw Jessica get escorted out that morning, Mark recognized her instantly. He could have intervened. One word from him, and the entire situation could have reversed course. But instead, he let it happen. He wanted it to happen, because he knew this would be the catalyst. All he had to do was stand still and let the dominoes fall. Now, with the partnership dead and panic spreading, Mark saw his opportunity. In the upcoming emergency board meeting, he would play the role of the calm, collected executive. He would express his shock at how things had unfolded. He'd subtly place blame on Harold for letting the culture slip to such an unprofessional standard. And then, when the dust settled, he'd be the last man standing, ready to take over and clean house. What Mark didn't know, what he could never have predicted, was that Jessica Carter had planned for all of this. She didn't just pull out of the deal, she'd done something far more dangerous. She had begun an investigation. Her legal team was quietly collecting data. Employees from Brenton, former and current, were reaching out with stories, with emails, with receipts. Whispers of discriminatory practices, biased promotions, and ignored complaints were forming into patterns that Jessica's team knew how to expose. While Mark was sipping scotch, Jessica was building a case. The irony was brutal. Mark had wanted to use Jessica's removal to push Harold out and seize the company, but in doing so, he had set a spotlight directly on himself. He had stepped out of the shadows just as Jessica's team turned their focus inward. The storm was coming, and it wasn't just about a deal anymore. It was about exposing the culture that had rotted Brenton from the inside out. A culture that had protected men like Mark, promoted people like Ashley, and silenced voices like Vanessa Moore, who had been watching quietly from the mezzanine that day, her fists clenched, her jaw tight, her heart screaming with familiar pain. Jessica Carter had walked out of Brenton's front doors with her head high and her silence loud. But her next move wasn't silence, it was strategy, and every single person who had smirked, stayed quiet, or turned a blind eye was about to feel the weight of that decision in full. Vanessa Moore hadn't said a word during the incident. She hadn't moved. She had simply stood there, frozen, as Jessica Carter, the woman she had admired from afar for years, was publicly humiliated and escorted out like a trespasser. From the mezzanine level, she had watched the whole thing play out with a hollow ache forming in her chest. It was a moment that left her torn in two, half of her burning with outrage, the other half paralyzed by the fear she'd spent her whole career learning to navigate. She knew exactly how that receptionist saw Jessica. She had felt it too, the hesitation in people's eyes, the way her intelligence was questioned, her tone policed, her presence treated like an anomaly. Vanessa had worked twice as hard, stayed twice as late, and still been passed over for promotions in favor of men who recycled her ideas in louder voices. And yet, even with all that behind her, she couldn't bring herself to step in, not when it could mean losing everything she had fought for. That guilt festered all day and long into the night. But then, 2 days after Brenton & Co.'s collapse had begun its very public unraveling, Vanessa received a call she never expected. Her phone rang with a blocked number, and when she answered, the voice on the other end was calm, firm, and instantly recognizable. "Vanessa Moore?" the woman asked. "This is Jessica Carter." Vanessa froze. For a moment she couldn't respond. Jessica's voice carried no anger, no bitterness, only purpose. "I saw you that day. I know you wanted to say something. I also know why you didn't, and I don't blame you." Those words alone unraveled something inside Vanessa, something tight that had been wrapped around her for years. Jessica continued, "I've read your reports, your work in predictive security modeling, your AI risk algorithms, your pilot proposal that was shelved 3 times. You've been overlooked too long. I'm not here to talk about what went wrong at Brenton. I'm here to talk about your future." What followed was more than a job offer. Jessica wasn't recruiting Vanessa. She was inviting her to lead. "We're launching a new initiative at Carter Innovations," she explained, "a division focused on AI-based cybersecurity. It's going to be huge, multi-billion-dollar investment. I want you at the head of it." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. She had been in meetings where her name wasn't even mentioned, where her credentials were ignored, where people asked her to bring coffee instead of ideas. And now this woman, this titan of the industry, was handing her the reins to a global project. Vanessa didn't say yes right away. She didn't have to. Jessica simply said, "Take 24 hours. Talk to your family, and if you say yes, I'll have your onboarding team reach out tomorrow. Either way, I want you to know you were seen, even when no one else looked." The next day, Vanessa said yes, and the day after that, she walked into the Carter Innovations headquarters, sunlight pouring in through towering windows, not to be watched or judged, but to be welcomed and respected. The difference was immediate. People greeted her by name. They had read her work. She wasn't just a token face or a quiet background voice. She was leading, building a team, designing systems. Her decisions mattered. For the first time, she felt what it meant to be seen not as a diversity hire, not as a checkbox, but as a force. But Jessica Carter wasn't done. In the weeks that followed, as Brenton and company slipped deeper into public disgrace and financial collapse, another plan was quietly set into motion. Jessica had been eyeing a specific property, one that had just hit the market due to Brenton's desperate liquidation. It was poetic, really. The very building where she had once been told to use the back entrance was now up for sale, a gleaming tower with modern lines and historic baggage. She bought it without blinking, but not to make a statement, not for revenge. Jessica had a bigger vision. When Vanessa was called into Jessica's office one morning for a special announcement, she assumed it was to review another round of AI models or budget approvals. But instead, Jessica slid a blueprint across the table. "The Carter Center for Innovation," she said. "That's what we're building, right here, on Brenton's former headquarters, a place where everything they got wrong will get right." Vanessa's fingers traced the layout: collaborative labs, open workspaces, mentorship hubs, funding offices for minority-led startups, classrooms for underserved youth. Jessica's voice softened. "This building humiliated me. It erased you. It enabled people like Ashley and Mark, but it doesn't have to stay that way. We're not just taking it back, we're transforming it, and I want you to run it." Vanessa looked up, stunned. "You mean, you want me to lead the center?" Jessica smiled. "I mean, I want you to be its CEO." For a long moment, Vanessa couldn't speak. She had never dared to imagine a future this expansive, this intentional. It wasn't just a new job. It was a rewriting of everything she had ever been told to settle for. Jessica reached out, gently placing a hand over hers. "I don't want the Carter Center to just be another tech incubator. I want it to be a symbol, a home for minds like yours, for people who were told they didn't belong, but came anyway." Vanessa accepted. The press release went live the next morning. Headlines lit up across the industry. "Carter Center for Innovation opens on former Brenton property. names Vanessa Moore as CEO. Social media exploded. Industry leaders took note. Politicians called for meetings. The symbolism was too strong to ignore, and the substance behind it was even stronger. In less than a year, Jessica had not only pulled her company out of a deal with Brenton, but turned that same rejection into a movement, a real, tangible shift in who gets to lead, who gets to build, and who gets to decide what the future looks like. And Vanessa Moore, the woman who once watched in silence, was now standing at the helm of a billion-dollar initiative, her voice no longer trembling, her ideas no longer silenced. She wasn't there to survive the system anymore. She was there to change it, from the inside out. The launch of the Carter Center for Innovation wasn't just a ribbon-cutting event. It was a cultural reset. Within weeks of opening, the building that once symbolized exclusion and quiet hostility had become a living, breathing symbol of change. It was filled with energy, ideas, and people who had never been given a real seat at the table. People who now, under Vanessa Moore's leadership, had their own tables, their own blueprints, their own visions being brought to life. The building buzzed not with whispers of who belonged, but with open-door conversations about what was next. Hallways echoed with pitches from young black founders, with mentorship sessions between veteran engineers and first-gen college students, with coding workshops for high school girls from neighborhoods no recruiter had ever stepped foot in. It didn't matter what someone looked like, where they came from, or who had underestimated them. At the Carter Center, ability was the only credential that mattered. Jessica Carter didn't need to be in the building every day to feel its heartbeat. She had designed it to function without her hand at the wheel, to live beyond her name. But she visited often, not for show, not for press, just to sit quietly in the corner of the innovation hub and watch people create. That was the legacy she cared about. Not titles or interviews, but impact. And every time she passed a young developer brainstorming with a mentor or saw a Latina founder pitch an idea that got immediate funding, she smiled. Not because it was unusual, but because now it wasn't. The headlines hadn't stopped since the center opened. Business magazines, tech forums, even international media had started calling the Carter Center a blueprint for the next generation of ethical, inclusive innovation. But for Jessica, none of that mattered as much as what happened behind the scenes. A note slipped under her office door from a young intern that read, "Thank you for building the place I've always dreamed of working." A single mother who told Vanessa, "For the first time in my career, I don't have to hide who I am to keep my job." That was the real power. That was the win. Meanwhile, far from the gleaming floors of the Carter Center, the fallout from Brenton's collapse continued to spread. Mark Jennings, once the smug architect of silent sabotage, had not only been exposed, but charged. His emails to Brenton's direct competitor had been traced, his financial dealings audited, and the empire he thought he was building had crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. He had gone from boardroom star to federal investigation headline. The final blow came not from a courtroom, but from the silence, partners cutting ties, networks ghosting him, opportunities vanishing like smoke. Alone in a rented apartment on the edge of the city, Mark watched a news segment one evening that showed Vanessa and Jessica standing shoulder to shoulder at a youth innovation summit. There were no theatrics, just two women leading a revolution that left no space for people like him. And for the first time, he understood. He hadn't just lost a game. He had never even understood the rules. Back in the city, Ashley Garner's life had unraveled at a steady pace. After her firing, she applied to over 50 jobs. At first, she tried to downplay what had happened, hoping employers wouldn't find the articles, the clips, the tweets. But in the digital age, nothing disappears. One hiring manager even recognized her mid-interview and ended it abruptly with a single sentence: "We don't tolerate that kind of behavior here." Soon, the emails stopped coming altogether. Friends distanced themselves. Her name became synonymous with the very kind of prejudice that Jessica's work aimed to dismantle. And in the most bitter twist of irony, Ashley found herself navigating a world that no longer made space for her. not because of her appearance, but because of her actions. Then came the court summons, a civil lawsuit for defamation and discrimination, led by Jessica Carter's legal team. The amount, $2 million, wasn't just about money. It was about accountability. Ashley broke down the day the papers arrived. Her savings couldn't cover a fraction of it. She had no legal defense, no leverage, no allies. It was a crushing reminder that while her judgment of Jessica had been casual, the consequences were anything but. But Jessica, even in power, never sought destruction for its own sake. Months into the legal process, Ashley received an unexpected offer through Carter's legal counsel, a complete dismissal of the financial penalty, in exchange for one thing: community service. Hundreds of hours at organizations that supported the very communities she had once disrespected. At first, Ashley thought it was a trap, some elaborate way to humiliate her further. But it wasn't. It was a second chance, one Jessica didn't have to give, but did. And so Ashley began to work, not in glossy offices or corporate lobbies, but in shelters, in youth programs, in grassroots tech training centers where she met people whose stories cracked open everything she once believed. She listened to single mothers fighting for second careers, to black girls coding through tears because no one had ever told them they were smart. Slowly, the cold exterior Ashley had once worn like armor began to shed. She stopped trying to defend her past. She just worked, quietly, gratefully, and over time, not everyone forgave her, but some did. More importantly, she began to forgive herself. Jessica never made a public statement about Ashley's transformation. She didn't need to. The Carter Center wasn't about grand gestures. It was about meaningful ones. And as Vanessa led the center through its first full year, launching satellite campuses, expanding funding programs, and helping over 10,000 people access tech education, it became clear the mission had never been about one person. It had always been about what was possible when those once kept out of the room were finally handed the keys. 1 year to the day after Jessica had been escorted out of Brenton's lobby, she stood on the rooftop of the Carter Center beside Vanessa. Below them, a block party was in full swing. Graduates from the first tech fellowship class were celebrating. Startups were pitching on an outdoor stage. Kids were building robots in the courtyard. Music played, laughter carried. Jessica leaned against the railing and said, almost to herself, "They thought they were pushing me out, but they were just giving me the room to build something bigger." Vanessa turned to her with a smile. "They didn't know who they were messing with." Jessica grinned. "They still don't." And with that, two women who had once stood in the shadow of a toxic system now stood above it, not with revenge in their hearts, but with purpose in their hands. Because that was the real legacy, not what they tore down, but what they built in its place.